Sure.
Okay, we're going to start. I see our numbers are down, but promise the quality will not fall off at all. I just would like to take a moment to introduce Craig Happold, Craig. I think I needed the break and didn't get it. It's Craig Schwitter from Bureau Happold, who's a consulting engineering firm that is really on the cutting edge of sustainability worldwide. And I had reached out to Craig to facilitate this panel because it's an area that he cares deeply about, knows a lot about, and some of you may know him because he also teaches here. So with that, I'll turn it over to Craig and he can introduce his panelists.
Right. Thank you very much. I want to thank panelists here, first of all, today, Megan, Suki, and Richard. Thank you very much for coming. I'd like to get through the comments and hopefully open it up to some dialogue and some question and answer, because this topic is very complicated, and I think it's important to have dialogue to discuss it. But just setting it up, broadly speaking, sustainability around financial, around social, and what was the third one? What was my Rick Perry? I was going to do a Rick Perry joke here about environmental. Okay. Three things, all right? The EPA. Energy, Department of Energy, get rid of the Department of Energy. No, I think the issue for us, and also for the course here, is that the social piece and the environmental piece of sustainability are obviously the ones that people gravitate to, but the financial piece is very important. Understanding the financial metrics of sustainability is the core to our course here. Understanding how that's affecting the development community and how it's going to affect development for the next 50 years in this city and around the world. It's very important to understand that triple bottom line, but also coring into the economic piece. Just 25 years from '86 to 2011, let's face facts. We've had an absolute historic period of low energy prices. Water's more expensive than gas. That's just the facts. And how is it in our economy that this is the case, that we have somehow prioritized these things? Well, we have, for all kinds of reasons, but let's not make bones about it. We've subsidized this. We have subsidized these low costs. If you want to get to the financial metrics of sustainability, you have to start understanding how we've subsidized it with wars, with buildup of industrial and military complex. We've also subsidized it in healthcare. Soaring healthcare costs and pollution and causes of mercury poisoning and other kinds of things in the environment, which regulatory pressures are still fighting against changing. So this is what's there. And what constrains this is of interest to me, but nothing's constrained it, quite frankly, in the development community over the last 25 years. Let's also face facts. The United States has developed a very wasteful system of use of buildings. We've exported that very effectively, the Heinz model, shall we say, to all over the world. We've exported this very wasteful way of dealing with transport, with energy, with density. And let's be honest, what also is going to constrain this? And what is going to constrain this is climate. If anybody doesn't agree with me here, it is there. It's not just a freak snowstorm occurrence. It is flooding. It is fires. It is unique weather events that are happening, changing the way insurance rates will happen, changing the way population densities will occur in the world. This is happening. I mean, the argument is sort of 10 years old right now, but it's there. And how will the market respond to it is the key for me. And maybe a greater key is what do we do to capitalize on that? What can we support to actually change that? To me, this is absolutely crucial because the tipping point, most people understand the tipping point to be between 2030 and 2050 on climate change. And it can be controlled. Now, why are buildings important? Why people in this room should care about it? 50% of the energy, 50% of the carbon in the United States comes from buildings. building them, operating them. This is fact, and it will get worse as we get more efficient transportation, we get less industrial footprints. In a city, it's 75 to 80% of the energy comes from buildings and use of buildings. So if you want to reduce carbon footprint of Manhattan, by the 2030 plan for the mayor, which is a fantastic plan emulated across the states, across the world, you have to do something about that 80%. And everyone here controls part of that. Everyone here does. And I don't think, quite frankly, in the public realm, this is quite understood yet in terms of how much our built environment actually impacts us and how much the solutions to that may well impact it. There's a growing awareness, though. We work with a lot of developers. There's a growing awareness of that value proposition. And it's not just, it's that value proposition because as these social and cultural trends start to intersect, next generations are looking for a different type of product. They're looking for issues around performance, potentially low energy, but more about lifestyle. And as lifestyle is that triple bottom line affects sustainability, that's where it starts coming in for that value proposition for a developer. What's next? I would say increased marginalization of product on the marketplace. My office hasn't done a non-LEED rated project in a while, and I doubt there will be any LEED, Class A LEED rated is synonymous at this point in time. It's hard to believe that that's going away. Globalized competition. You better believe that other countries are doing it better than us at this point in time, and we better get better at this. Because as carbon does get taxed potentially, that will just make simply our buildings, aka our cars, our 1980 cars, very inefficient, and we're going to have to get better with them. There is increasing regulatory and pressure, but also consumer pressure for change. This is still coming. There's been a slowdown within the recession, but it's definitely coming. And I would say also what's next in terms of the data and sophistication of collection of data is changing rapidly. iPhones, iPads, smartphones, whatever. It's that kind of feedback loop that will change the behavior that is potentially a source of real opportunity. Opportunity in our developments, but opportunity in change. So finally, I just want to say, final thought for the panelists. We know that better density and higher density modeling, and we know patterns of development that are better. But how do you approach climate change within these issues? And there's kind of two camps. The first camp comes from, I don't know if you know Super Freakonomics, Stephen Levitt was the author. In the first part of the book, he talks about density in the beginning part of the century, late 1800s. The largest challenge to density in urban environments was horse manure. It was a public health disaster. It was preventing large urban dense areas from becoming more dense, and it completely got eradicated by a technological evolution called the combustion engine. So we could hope that climate change just goes poof, and everything that we're doing is fine. The other way is to realize that actually to solve it, we have all the solutions right now. I don't know if you track Ed Masria or 2030 or the architecture challenges. We have the technology at our disposal to do this. Part of the things is getting the financial levers to make sure the decisions are being made, that the real financial impact of the decisions are being understood. So I don't know about you. I mean, maybe there's this horse maneuver poof thing coming. But in case there isn't, I certainly want my son, my grandson, to be in a world where climate change doesn't screw us totally. And the only chart that I've seen, by the way, on that crazy chart, is the one of global warming. That's the only one out there. And that spike is even greater than what we're looking in that financial graph. So I don't want to get everybody down here. I'm saying that there are real solutions out there. And I think that this problem, as it intertwines between finance and what this panel can shed, is really part of the opportunity that I'd like to seek. So with that, Richard?
you think if you think Craig is depressed, what do you know? I came and I heard all the first two panels. In the first one, I was really enthusiastic about everything that Vishaan and Kate said, and so much of which I've been saying and I agree with, and had some minor comments I was going to make. But then I heard the second panel, and I'm glad that Hank Bell is both a realist and an optimist, but I found that I think I can sum up the second panel as buy low and sell high, which I think were two of the panelists, at least, after all the charts and graphs said. And I guess in a school of real estate or department of real estate, which I'm not sure should be in a building of Department of Architecture, I think we are friendly, we're frenemies in a sense. Obviously, everything an architect does depends on financing, but buying low and selling high is not going to get us out of the mess that Craig so well described. So let me go on to some of what we do and some hopeful examples, I hope, of how one can save energy and occasionally make money for clients. We've been working in New York for many, many years. My very first important building was for the Estee Lauder Company. And those interested in finances among you, this was finished in 1968, and it cost $13.15 a square foot. And that wasn't the fee, that was the construction cost. And it was incredibly energy efficient, really nothing sophisticated, but I had long been fascinated about the potato barns on Long Island. If you dig in the earth is mostly the same temperature year-round. So this building is partially earth-sheltered. Let me just go back. And because it was so efficient, and the panels, which were based on the White Tower hamburger stands, porcelain enamel with a foam glass insulation, were also so efficient that when we built a series of more buildings around this, the same boiler was used to power the other buildings. We did not need an additional heat source. Because I've been working for this company around the world for the last, God knows how many years, I've had the wonderful opportunity of adding on to buildings designed years ago. The blue brick building, this is in Belgium, on the way to Antwerp. The building, which Sam Brody and I wanted very much to be white, Estee Lauder was then selling Youth Dew. None of you are old enough to remember Youth Dew. But it came in these beautiful blue packages, and she issued the edict that it should be blue. And 30 years passed, and this became loved by everybody in Belgium. So when we added this energy-efficient new layer over it, we were careful to keep that little piece of history. Europe is so much more ahead of us in energy conservation. Another example for Estee Lauder in Switzerland this time, the building in the way background was designed in the late 70s. It had what was then the energy efficient features of north-facing skylights, like those wonderful buildings by Albert Kahn, were all naturally lit, where the bombers and tanks of World War II were made around in Michigan. Years later, just a few years ago, we added what's one of the most energy efficient centers in Europe. It's a building that's earth sheltered, has a green roof, has a cogeneration plant. It has on the outside, on the right, glass sunshades, exterior blinds, which are really the only way to keep heat out of a building, because blinds inside the building just absorb heat and re-radiate it. And you see the green roof, which is primarily to keep rainwater from flooding the sewer system. As much as I would like to take credit for the brilliance of the energy conservation, it's simply the law in Switzerland. We were required to do all these things, as we are increasingly in the United States. It's also a wonderful law beyond energy in Switzerland that every worker has to have a view out a window. And that, in this era of LEED and energy conservation, we should also think about what's sustainable for the people living in a building. Closer here in New York, in Battery Park, we just finished the headquarters of the Conservancy, the folks that keep those beautiful gardens. This is a LEED Platinum. It's a very high level of energy conservation. There is a double glass wall in the front here. People can actually walk between two layers of glass, and what that does, it's a kind of breathing wall. In the winter, the warm air is sent, because it faces south, the warm air is sent into the building to help heat it. In the summer, of course, the warm air is shed and it's sent outside the building. And at the top, a company that's done the wonderful marketing gesture of calling these big-ass fans. They're 17 feet in diameter. They're a very simple, old-fashioned way to keep heat constant throughout a structure. In institutional architecture, this is a library in the Bronx, and some of the green stuff. This was the first public building to achieve a LEED Silver rating in New York City. I have a problem with LEED because it's like, you know, that comment about somebody who knows the price of everything and the value of nothing. New Yorkers, all of us, should get LEED Platinum just for living in the city, because as Craig will tell you, a New York resident uses about 1/3 the energy of a typical suburban. So when Hank was saying, you know, when you have 2 kids, you should move out to Scarsdale and send them to school, and what he didn't say is then commute to New York in your car and schlep the kids to soccer practice. I live in Upper Manhattan in Washington Heights, and many, many young couples have moved in. They're sending their kids to, get ready, public school. And they're paying far less taxes. The kids and the parents are walking to school, and the parents, like I do, get on the A train and go downtown. So there is density, as was said in the first panel, is terrific. This building is not only because it keeps people in the neighborhood, but it's a modern library is now a portal to sustainable urban life. This building opened in a largely Latino Dominican neighborhood. It's the center for Latin culture for the city of New York, for the New York Public Library. The day it opened, 5,000 people streamed into this building. It's a library with 140 computer terminals. People go here to learn English, to look for work, to have their teenage kids here after school, and downstairs there's a cultural center with a theater. Another way to measure sustainability beyond a scoring system. We have done the scoring system for the New York City schools, and all the new schools are now being built according to this somewhat simpler scoring system. This is a recently finished school in Battery Park. It's very efficient also because it occupies a very small amount of land. This is, in a sense, it illustrates Vishaan's density point in one building. It's an 8-story school. Not too many 8-story primary and middle schools around, but we've zoned it so the little kids are on the lower floors, kindergarten, 1st, 2nd grade. The older kids are on the top, 6th, 7th, and 8th floors, and in between is the cafeteria and the library and all the public spaces. So the kids, the bigger kids, can of course schlep up the stairs, and they are encouraged to use the stairs as a not only energy conserving, but a health conserving feature. These are some of the many, you know, I won't read all these things, but the one interesting thing is at the roof there are photovoltaic cells, and they do furnish just about all the energy needed for the public spaces, the corridors, the stairways. Obviously not yet enough to run the whole school. The School Construction Authority has an attempt to design a school that actually will produce as much energy as it uses, a so-called zero net energy school. And perhaps later with Craig we can talk about what that really means, because there are many ways to measure that. But just to break it down to the takeaway, the only way to make a school like this work is, first of all, reduce as much energy use as you can by bringing in natural light, natural ventilation when you can, geothermal when it's available. And the other thing is to put a huge array of photovoltaics, which are coming down in price, largely because they're being made in China, on the roof to balance the energy use and the energy expenditure. And just a few more examples. In residential architecture, I should say affordable residential architecture, which really is a challenge. One of the problems of the whole discussion in the second panel, which is how do you make money on real estate, the reality of affordable housing is the only way you do it is through the most incredibly complex financing mechanism that I've done many of these. I refuse to understand it because it's so complicated. There are tax credits, there's money from the borough president. It should be simpler. And I think in Europe it is simpler because it's considered social housing. It's considered, in a sense, a right, that everybody should have a right to a decent place to live. So my developer clients, in this case Jonathan Rose, who is an extremely sensitive client concerned with sustainability and human well-being, is willing to take the extra effort to put a building like this together. This is David Dinkins Gardens in Harlem, where we did all kinds of things like sunshades, rainwater collection, green roof. I won't go into all the details. And this is perhaps the most interesting and sustainable affordable project in New York at the moment. We, with our partners at Phipps, Rose, and Grimshaw Architects, won the competition for Via Verde. It's a 220-unit affordable complex in the Bronx. And it does all the LEED things, which I'm sure you can read and you will learn about if any of you are studying about LEED. But the most interesting thing to me is it's a kind of neighborhood in a building. We met with neighborhood residents. We tried to elicit what they were interested in. The building has 4 different kinds of housing. The tower is normal residential rental apartments for people within affordable limits. The middle section are duplexes, which are actually purchased, again, on an affordable basis. And just out of the picture at the right hand are townhouses, which are purchased. So rather than creating a kind of oasis of one kind of tenancy with all its problems, this is really a community. On the ground floor is the 4th kind of housing type. It's a work-live apartment where people have actually a door on the street. They might be an accountant or a craftsman and actually do something in their apartment, and somebody can walk in and use their services. The roof, designed with a wonderful landscape architect, Lee Weintraub, that we worked with, has become yet another surface, and people will be growing vegetables here. There are photovoltaic arrays. The left-hand image is a computer rendering, which often lie, but the right hand is the real building under construction. It will be finished next year, and we are gratified how much the actual project looks like this. And Vishaan and others in the city were great proponents of this. Sean Donovan, who's now down in Washington. This was meant to be replicable, and I hope it will be, but it's so difficult to replicate all these factors. And just a final commercial, which will be a wonderful segue to my colleague architect. This is one of President Obama's stimulus projects. Yes, there are some. A federal building in downtown Newark, the Rodino building, was typical of so many buildings of the 1960s. A precast concrete building where the precast concrete was beginning to spall because the rebars inside rust, and pieces of concrete were falling on our citizenry down below. We looked at many different ways to save it. Do we take off the skin and reskin it? Do we tear the building down and build a new one? And the most interesting way, and the cheapest, least expensive, I shouldn't use the word cheap, was to wrap it, to shrink wrap it in a new breathing curtain wall, which again conserves heat in the wintertime, it sheds heat in the summertime, but perhaps most of all tells the folks of Newark, and God knows they need an uplifting message, that there is a modern, safe federal presence in their city. That halo on top are photovoltaic cells, which will create, again, enough energy for the public spaces. And the building will create a, I'm trying to, there's just 2 more slides. Sadly, one of the new definitions of sustainability is keeping people safe from terrorism. It's a very unfortunate development, especially for architects, because it means, especially for all of us, obviously, I don't mean to be flip. So this building, with the appropriate engineering consultants, was made bomb resistant with all the different things like standoff and special glass. But at the same time, the upside is it also encloses spaces for people to get in and out of the rain while they're waiting to go into immigration, for example. And it really dignifies the public sphere, which to me is the most important measure of sustainability. And one final slide, this is our own office. We just moved into a loft floor in the Garment Center, 26,000 square feet. And we got it at the bottom of the market, so we're happy. So we architects too are capitalists, although we wish we didn't have to be. You know, the famous joke about architects when they get together is they say, "Oh, hey, I'm losing money on every project," and somebody says, well, "How do you make a living?" He says, "Volume." You guys don't get it. This is going to be a LEED Gold building. And it's sustainable, a happy place to work where we all face the good fight to make the world sustainable for all of us. Thanks.
Thank you, Richard. Next up is Megan McDermott.
There we go. Thank you, Craig. It's interesting, this term of climate change and sustainability that's certainly become an issue and a buzzword in our culture. The way that, what it really means to people and what it means to our clients who we work with on buildings, it's quite different to different people. And so I'm going to show you a couple of images of some of the work that we're doing. I'm actually going to skip ahead here. And highlight some of the issues that we're finding, that we're talking about with primarily our development clients. So I do primarily commercial work, but our firm does all different kinds of buildings. We do academic and institutional work, we do apartment buildings, as well as office buildings. And really, sustainable design has been a fundamental tenet of our design practice. For many years before the LEED scorecard system was employed and codified now in this country. And one of the things that I always think is interesting is that sustainability is not a style, although for many years, I think until recently, many of our clients had a preconception that in order for a building to be a green building, it has to be really high tech and look very futuristic and look like something new and different. And you can see there's a broad stylistic range to the work that we do in our firm. And it's really about a specific building and a specific location and what are the most intelligent, cost-effective, thoughtful design strategies that one can employ given a particular situation. As I mentioned, we do both academic and institutional and commercial work. One of the things that we're finding in our academic buildings is the notion of empowering the end users or the stakeholders and changing behavior. And for example, the building at the top is the Park Center for Business and Sustainable Enterprise at Ithaca. It's the business school, and the curriculum there now is actually has a very strong sustainability component to it, not just related to design issues, but in business, what are sustainable techniques for any kind of different business function or that you're undertaking. And it's a very collegial environment. It really fosters collaboration. It's a LEED Platinum building. It was the first LEED Platinum business school in the US, but that's part of their core curriculum and their values now. And we're seeing that all across many academic institutions now. That's become very important. And the building on the bottom at Choate Rosemary Hall, this is going to be a new environmental center where students live and study, and it's going to be a net zero building as well. But they're actually using gaming and competition among the students to actually track their energy use, to measure which team is consuming the least amount of energy, and they have a dashboard. And this is actually being incorporated by some of the corporate clients that we work with as well, so that if you can show people how much they're using, how much energy they're using, and what can they do to improve that, it actually becomes empowering, and it helps the life of the building, the use of the building to be much more effective and much more energy efficient. In the commercial arena, what we're finding is that the first generation of LEED buildings has come online and has now been occupied for a number of years, and we're finally starting to get data and metrics. We can measure the performance of the building, the energy savings, how long was the payback period, what was the first cost, what was the additional cost, the premium, in order to achieve, say, a LEED Gold or a Platinum rating. And these happen to be a couple of buildings that we've done for Liberty Property Trust, a publicly traded REIT in Pennsylvania. The top right is the plaza at PPL. This is an energy company in Allentown. They chose to stay in Allentown to revitalize that community, which has been depressed since the steel industry left. The payback on that was 2.5 years, and the incremental first cost was less than 4% of the total construction cost. The building on the bottom left is a spec office building, only 80,000 feet at the Philadelphia Navy Yard. LEED Platinum, 3% first cost, and they achieve the highest rental rates of any other building in Philadelphia except for the Comcast Center. So what we're finding is that when we work with new commercial development clients, when they think about their investment and when they're trying to attract investors, these metrics are really important. But just because you have a LEED rated building and you have that certificate a year later, that doesn't really mean anything for conserving energy use in your community if the building isn't operated and maintained properly. And if people don't if the shade controls and the lighting sensors aren't working and being used properly when they've been designed to do that, you really have to monitor those things, and you have to have a very proactive management of these buildings. And so one of the things that we talk about with our clients and with the city sometimes is the idea of incentives being delayed until a building has been online for more than a year, tax incentives or credits and things that you have to demonstrate as an owner that you really are committed to saving energy by the way your building is managed and maintained and operated. This is the Comcast Center in downtown Philadelphia. Started out as a spec building but became a corporate headquarters build-to-suit for Comcast. And this is a public winter garden space at the base of the building, and the idea of creating, using private investment on the part of a developer to create a public amenity. This is a public living room in downtown Philadelphia. There's a plaza outside. You want to create, this is not only the entrance to their building, but it's also an entrance to the railway station below grade. So it's really not only the public living room, but a major transportation hub. And how do you create a really dramatic space like this with using very cost-efficient techniques. Richard mentioned this concept, I think, in one of his projects, but we have a double wall system at the lower portion of the building. That's where people are going to be occupying the space. So we condition it from the floor below. The double wall helps provide extra insulation from the exterior. We use interior sunshades and devices that stop the downdraft. So the portion of the space that you really have to climatize is quite small compared to the volume of the space. So we look for smart techniques, and there are many others which I won't go into, to really make it feasible to have a dramatic space like this, which really gives something back to the city and is not just for the use of the building occupants. We do quite a lot of work internationally, and I thought the discussion of density was interesting this morning. I'll come back to that in just a moment. One of the things in the global marketplace now is that all office building tenants expect a high quality of environment around the world, whether they're in the US or Paris or London or India or China. There is an expectation now of a certain level of quality, but that really has a different baseline, a different starting point in different locations. This is a building at La Défense that's under construction, and La Défense, as you probably know, is it's a commercial district just west of Paris, so downtown Paris on the Champs-Élysées. And those buildings are 40 and 50 years old now, and most of them are Class B or Class C by now because they're slowly falling apart. The HVAC systems are completely out of date. It wasn't designed to be a 24-hour community. There's no street life. It really has a moat around it. It's like a fortress. There's a ring road, and you can't actually walk to it from any of the surrounding towns. And so, you know, the government of France really wants to turn this around and make this one of the premier green business and residential communities now in Europe. They would kind of want to take what Canary Wharf did and bring this to this location in Paris, but also add a residential component so it's a more lively city. So a lot of those projects, you might have seen images of them are on hold because of economic reasons right now, but this building is on target to be not only LEED Gold, but to also match the French equivalent, which is HQE. And it's really because, you know, from a marketing perspective, and in order to attract investment, they need to be able to say that the building meets both standards, standards that multinational companies will be able to understand. And then we're doing several projects in India, and the starting point there, when we talk about sustainable design, is vastly different. There is often no grid. There's no reliable infrastructure. This is in Gurgaon. This is the first phase of a mixed-use commercial and residential and retail development. And there's very little water. There's either too much in monsoon season or there's not enough. And so, you know, the benchmarks that we start with here, you really have to start from a totally different set of circumstances in this environment. What's also interesting in places like Gurgaon, this issue of density made me think of it, that what you get are a series of little island developments. Each development like this has its own power plant because they can't rely on the infrastructure. Then security is often an issue, and this is a longer conversation than we probably have time for now, but you get a series of small, sustainable little islands of development, but the spaces between them are nothing. There is no sort of urban context. It's just a series of individual developments that start to populate the landscape, and they have no relationship to each other. So it's a very challenging environment. And then, of course, you know, the use of water and all of the energy issues. We spend quite a lot of time looking for the most cost-effective ways to deal with these problems in a place like India. And finally, Richard showed the commercial project where they've reskinned the building, and I really think that we have an amazing existing building stock in our cities around the US, perfectly sound structures, which are right where they need to be at the center of the cities, and they may not have HVAC, air conditioning and heating systems that are up to date. They might need to be reskinned. The windows may not be, they may not function well anymore thermally to provide a good envelope for the building, but this is where we see a huge amount of work coming in the future because they're perfectly located. They're at the place where public transportation is, and people can walk to them. They can take, and I think this is really one of the key opportunities and one of the things that we really need to focus on in our cities in terms of reviving this building stock and bringing more density and greater energy efficiency as a result in these locations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our final speaker, Sukyana Pakyurek from Vornado.
Thanks, Craig. Good afternoon, everyone. I'll make my comments brief so that we can actually spend some time answering some of Craig's tough questions. But I'll start with the conversation with, I think, kind of three themes that I've seen over the past few years in terms of sustainability, and talk a little bit more in depth about them. The first is that it's happened fast, and there have been a lot of drivers kind of culminating together at the same time that have really forced us to take these issues seriously. The second is that it's actually what we've figured out, I think, hopefully, that sticks, is that it's cheaper and faster to affect demand than it is to affect supply in the markets that we're in right now. And the last thing is that most of the green that we're seeing is probably still greenwash, but that's changing slowly. So let's start with the first one. It's happened fast, and it's happening because there are a lot of drivers. What we've seen over the past 5 years, I'd say, is that we've had a couple of different sources of forces of pressure that have focused companies like Vornado and other real estate companies, large REITs even, to look at sustainability critically. And the three that I'd say are investors, graduates, and government. The investor piece may be a little bit obvious. A lot of our major investment groups are European-based pension funds, all of which generally have their own sustainability policies. And a lot of it's driven in the European markets by Kyoto and kind of national protocols that are eventually trickling down into the pension funds and trickling down into their investor groups. So over the past 3 years, I've met with probably, half a dozen to a dozen investor groups based out of Europe whose sole question at the times they're asking questions about are sustainability. So we've met with them, talked to them about what we're doing, taken tours of our cogen plant, and given them kind of a blueprint for what Vornado sees as our sustainability path. The second driver, and this might seem a little strange, are graduates. And by graduates, I really mean 25-year-olds that are leaving college. My very first week at Vornado, when we had a corporate sustainability policy, but not necessarily programs associated with them yet, and I'd been hired generally to oversee kind of that development and implementation. We met with a large tenant base here in New York. It was a law firm in one of our existing buildings, and they were actually coming up for renewal on their lease. So who was very new to my job, was asked by our president and our head of leasing to come to the meeting, and not knowing any better, I told them I'd go. And the head of the company at the time, as we started talking about lease renewal, said to our president at the time, we're happy to stay in this building, but one of our key requirements is that it's a LEED certified building by the time we actually roll our lease, which was in 2012. So our president looked over him and he said, so is that something we can do? And I said, yeah, of course it's something that we can do. We left the room and he said, well, is it really something we can do? I said, I think so. We'll have to look into it a little bit more. And since that time, that was in 2008, since that time we've LEED EB certified over half of the portfolio in New York. But the more telling part of that story is that in response, our president actually asked the question, well, you guys have been in this building for 10 years and you never raised any of these issues, what's changing? And the guy said, well, over the last 2 years, every interview that we've done for kids coming out of Yale and Harvard or any school that we've hired out of, every student, one of the questions on their checklist is, what are you doing about sustainability? How green is your company? And he said, and frankly, we're not doing anything, so we're assuming that you're going to take care of it for us, so we can check the box. So that's graduates. The last piece is government. And, in the markets that we're in, Vornado is generally in large markets, New York, DC, Chicago, San Francisco. In all of those markets, while national legislation is still lacking, local government has taken over. And what we're seeing is that Energy Star benchmarking, energy efficiency, all of those things are not only kind of the front runner or the leadership position, but frankly, now the more normative things that people are expected to do. The second piece, it's cheaper and faster to deal with demand than it is supply. I'll I'll just tell you that I started my career actually in the energy industry. And when I first started, we used to look at, those graphs about supply and demand and, kind of where energy goes. And in the U.S., for every unit of energy that comes into the energy grid, essentially a third of that actually gets delivered to the market. And I remember thinking at the time, God, if we could really figure out how to make supply more efficient, we'd kind of figure out the supply issue altogether. But after I took this job, I realized that I actually had it completely wrong. In fact, it's actually the reverse, which is that if we can figure out how to fix demand, for every kilowatt hour saved or every kBtu saved, you're actually saving 3 kilowatt hours or 3 kBtu from the grid, right? So that's actually where the big discrepancy is. And the other part is it's actually much easier to actually impact demand than it is supply, because it's really behavior-based or infrastructure-based, which we'll talk about in a second. The last piece, which is most green, is actually greenwash. It is changing. It's changing slowly, but it is changing. And one of the things that's changed, certainly, as we look at the real estate sector, is that every new development that we see, and certainly from Vornado we have a corporate commitment to do this, but you've now heard from two great speakers who have shown you examples of what LEED buildings look like, LEED Gold, LEED Platinum, kind of emerging leadership looks like in new buildings. And I think Megan was right. I think the challenge now is really in the existing buildings portfolio. If you look at the New York City 2030 plan, and you look at kind of the focus of what's going to happen over how to achieve our climate change plan, a lot of that focus is on buildings, and it's because 70 to 80% of our carbon impact is really happening in the built environment. And 80% of the square footage that exists today is going to exist 30 years from now, right? So we're not, even if we build at rates that are that have been historically high, even then, the existing portfolio is really the challenge that we're facing. And to do it right, I think there are 3 key pieces that the existing built environment leadership looks like. I think first is you have to deal with the tenant base, which is behavior-based. Most buildings in New York and around the country are multi-tenanted, either multi-family or multi-officed or multi-retailed. And figuring out how to deal with that behavior piece is essential, because at some point, even if you built the best, even if you upgraded all your existing buildings to have incredible technology and infrastructure, you need people to still turn off the lights or figure out how to actually use that space correctly, like Megan said. The second piece is operations, and trying to give the people that actually run your buildings some power and, frankly, some education in terms of what it actually means to run an efficient building. And the last piece, which is something that we've just recently got our heads around, is infrastructure. In terms of the built environment, one of the key challenges is the fact that the people that build, once people build buildings, the operator generally of the building, the chief engineer, the engineering team, often have almost no power and no authority in terms of budgeting for that building. And that's, even in a company like Vornado, where we're generally very thoughtful about the way we budget, what I found over the past 3 years is that if I wasn't directly related to a project, or if another person within the energy group wasn't directly related to a project, the project probably wasn't going to go forward. And we heard that complaint over and over again. So I would take over a lead project, we talk to the engineers, and they say, I'd say, okay, so what kind of projects are you looking to do? Let's talk about the energy efficiency piece. And they say, oh, well, for the past 10 years, every year I put it in my budget, but it's come out. So we'd look at the list again, and I'd say, well, what's the problem? They say, well, I put it in, and then it goes to my property manager, and the property manager looks at the list, and sometimes will or won't put it in the budget, depending on what other issues they have in the budget season. And essentially, between layer 1 and layer 2, all of the projects would come out, because there wasn't an advocate at the table. So we, I think, for the first time, finally figured out that, in fact, we probably just need to budget this differently than we budget everything else. That, in fact, energy efficiency for things that have paybacks that are actually making the buildings better over the long term and making them more competitive in terms of operating costs should actually be budgeted not with a lobby renovation or an elevator upgrade or new lighting systems. It should actually be a standalone budget. So that's kind of where we're going with this thing. And I think, to add to what Megan said, I think the key challenge to existing buildings is that the leadership position, and there are several companies that are doing this quite carefully, thoughtfully, I think the real challenge is to make it, instead of the leadership position, to make it a normative kind of reality for sustainability, to be the thing that people actually look to. So I'll leave it at that. Craig?
That's great. Do we have some time for some questions? Yeah, 10 minutes. Okay, that's great. I'll start off with one question to the panel, and then I'd like to get some of your input. And you've treaded over some of this, but what do you think is going to push greater in terms of solutions in the next 5 years? The issue of regulatory or government pressure or consumer market-driven pressure? Which will have a greater impact on this aspect of commercial development going on in terms of the economics of green?
I think regulatory, because I've worked with some of these companies that have been mentioned, and very often when it comes to the final budget, energy efficiency, even the most simple energy efficiency is sometimes laid aside. So I think, in a sense, forcing people to live right at the beginning, and someday, you know, as we all become more sensitive, we will all do this because we understand the importance. But unfortunately, I think you need the regulations as much as I find them annoying and picky and everything else. But I think they're necessary.
I think I'll just add to that by saying I think consumers and general investor interests brings up the top, so generally sets the leadership position, and it makes people competitive. But I think regulation brings up the bottom, right? So I think what we're seeing is that gap, is that kind of strata shrinking as regulation kind of starts to bump kind of energy efficiency up, and that kind of top piece kind of still narrowing a little bit.
Thank you.
Yeah, excuse me. Yeah, I think you absolutely do need regulation. You really, I would even go beyond that. I think incentivizing would make a difference in the short run. But I know that in the marketplace, and mentioned the recent grads, that there is absolutely now an expectation, even from a marketing perspective, for people who are going to look for a new apartment building or a place to work. There's an expectation that this sustainable thinking is already there, and that performance, that quality level of the interior environment, and that good citizenship and good stewardship, if you will, I think that's a ground up movement that is going to put more and more pressure to make this happen.
Are there any questions from the audience?
Can you define greenwash?
It's a lot of good marketing without a lot of thoughtfulness behind it, not a lot of substance. I mean, within real estate, we see it often enough. I think there are a lot of people that love to talk about programs and choices that they've made that don't necessarily actually have a real impact. And we've tried. Vornado, I think, strategically does not have a PR group. It's an intentional choice because we don't like to talk to the press and a lot of other things. But I think the opposite is true of people that want to take advantage of kind of the green market. And I think what we've seen is that people that have a leadership position in this generally don't talk about it very much and are putting their heads down and doing their work. And the people that want to kind of get kudos for it and get marketing benefit for it are the ones that are talking the loudest. And it's often just a veil. So.
I think that photograph, that ad for I Live in the Everglades was a good example of greenwash, with a picture of nature next to that woman in a ridiculous high-rise.
Kate?
I just want to know what you guys think of this GSAPP rating system as a tool to really describe whether buildings aren't sustainable. Because it seems to me, from my years at Vornado, rather a blunt instrument and one that's very highly manipulable. And I wonder, A, whether you think it's any good to begin with, and two, whether you guys who really do this for a living have thought that there might be a better way to actually evaluate both new and old buildings, new and existing buildings.
Well, don't get me started. No, look, I think it's important because it makes people aware of all the different ways you can save energy. The problem is that little factoid that a building, an inefficient building in downtown Manhattan is much, quote, greener than one of these wonderful buildings that you see out in Edge City or wherever, where everybody drives to get there. Because like the concept of total net zero energy, it depends where you're measuring. It's not so hard to do a building. It's hard, but not impossible to do a little building where you only measure the building. You put a lot of PV cells on the roof, and you have small windows and whatever, and it's a net zero. It makes a lot of energy, it uses less, etc. When you start measuring it at the source, and as you said, you know, only a third of what we're making gets there, it's not quite such a simple thing. So it's a very blunt tool, and it basically rewards cleverly designed suburban buildings at the expense of energy. If you go back to the first panel, and everybody lived along a mass transit system, as Vishaan illustrated, and either walked or took a subway or a bus to work, maybe just a national policy of forcing everybody to move to New York, Chicago, or look, I grew up in Buffalo, which was, when I was a kid, one of the great cities of the United States. Of course, now, like Detroit and Toledo and so many other cities, I cry every time my plane lands there. But a national policy, Buffalo is largely depopulated. When I lived there, it had 600,000 people. It now has 250. You could say the same thing about Cleveland, about Detroit, so there are all these vacant houses and all this vacant land. So just to comment on Hank's comment about, boy, you could make a lot of money by buying cheap land in Phoenix. I have flown over Phoenix in a jet plane, and it takes 45 minutes from one end of that sprawl in a plane going 500 miles an hour to get to the other end. It's insane. A national policy that would give urban homesteading, for example, will give you, if you build a house or fix up a house, which you can buy in Buffalo for $80,000 for a beautiful Victorian mansion, we will give you tax breaks, you're going to save energy, there's a sewer system, there's an electric system. When I was a kid, there used to be streetcars. There is a transit system under Main Street, but a policy like that for every mid-sized American city, industrial city, that's seen all the people go to unsustainable places like Phoenix, where there's no water, not enough water to sustain everybody, that would be an intelligent national sustainable policy, which would have a major, major impact. But don't get me started.
Megan, do you have a...
No, the only thing I would add to that is it's just that the current rating system, I mean, now we have several different rating systems within that, but it certainly does provide many of the points that you get for being in an urban location to begin with, and and that's for obvious reasons. And as Richard said, to build a LEED Platinum corporate campus that parks 4,000 cars who drive 20 to 40 miles each way to get to and from that facility, it's kind of an oxymoron, really.
Any other questions? In the back?
I got a question. Why, when you talk to engineers about energy saving investments, they talk in terms of payback. They talk in terms of payback periods. When those of us who are in the real estate value creation business, we talk in terms of cap rates. So I had an engineer tell me, solar technology doesn't work because you need a 5-year payback. And I'm saying, well, I'm building a building that's going to sell for a 5% cap rate. Isn't that a 20-year payback? And who's going to segregate out the cost savings from the solar technology on the roof when they go to value my building? And so there seems to be a huge disconnect there. And I think if more, maybe is there a way to, am I right about that, or am I just misreading it?
You're absolutely right about that. The language is different, and that's part of the reason that it's taken so long, I think, for people to actually, for kind of corporate, to talk to the engineering staff. And I think it's a very common issue that I think most companies face, actually, is that just the language barrier alone doesn't get you through the door. And part of what we've tried to bridge over the past few years is to link payback to IRR or cap rate, so that people are actually talking at least some parallel language that they can each understand. Because as soon as, I'll be very frank, when I sent up the memo to say, all right, we should do this separately because these projects have a 3-year payback, i.e., an IRR or cap rate that you would consider investment grade, right? Everyone said, well, of course we should do it. Why haven't we done it so far? I mean, that was all, it's almost all that people needed to hear was that there was a linkage between their language and kind of the language of what energy efficiency was.
But a 10-year payback would be a winner. And I don't hear anybody in the kind of technical side of things even knows that. Especially when there are all these collateral benefits for marketing and things like that.
Sure, and it really is a language issue. I mean, you start talking about it, and the reason that everybody keeps saying, well, I have a shorter payback than whoever else's technology is because they don't speak the same language.
Here?
A question for Susie. Are you seeing any kind of a split bifurcation in your portfolio in that, as far as office goes, you absolutely must be green to achieve Class A status and premium rents vis-a-vis your multifamily portfolio, where perhaps it hasn't caught on as strongly, and where your office tenants will pay a premium, will your renters pay a premium for green multifamily?
So we don't have a lot of multifamily, so I can't answer that question, but I will answer the commercial office piece anyway. What we're seeing is not a green premium. What we're seeing is a non-green, perhaps negative, right? So the way I usually describe it to people is we have at least half of our floor space in New York as LEED certified now. And what we find is that those tend to be the higher occupied buildings. So we're occupying them very, very quickly because all of the corporate tenants that are looking for space today, it's on their checklist. And if you don't actually check the box, you don't get on the short list, right? So we haven't seen a single major lease come through over the last 5 years, 3 years, let's say, that didn't have it on the checklist. And the more serious people will take you off their short list if you haven't checked the box at all. So while I wouldn't say we've seen a rent premium, because I get that question a lot even from the USGBC, which is, haven't you guys seen a premium for the buildings that you've taken through the process? And the answer is no, we haven't seen a premium. But we've also kept tenants, and we've also signed a lot more leases because we can say we've been thoughtful about it. In terms of the concern about Class A, I'll say this, it is a real concern. So because half of our square footage is green and half of it's not yet green, or labeled anyway, there is a concern about, well, does Class A and green actually mean the same thing? And we're not there yet, but it looks like it's going in that direction.
We have time for one more question here. I think this gentleman.
Thanks. It seems like there is consensus that dealing with the existing buildings is really where the big potential payoff and challenge is. I think I've heard that in 2050, 90% of the buildings that we need to change will already have been built, exist today, that is. So aside from mandating that people move to Buffalo, urban buildings are still quite inefficient. American buildings, especially, compared to the energy usage of European buildings and such. Can you guys talk more about how to attack existing buildings in a cost-effective way to make them more energy and resource efficient? I think we've kind of barely touched on that, and it seems to be a big issue.
I think Craig should answer that because he probably knows that better than anybody.
I would say the number one strategy would probably be envelope. I mean, I'll give you an example. We did a federal building, 600,000 square foot federal building. It's in Hawaii, actually. Had a single glazed facade. Terribly inefficient. Terribly inefficient. Had to run the HVAC system so hard that people had to bring in space heaters into their desks. We managed to, with an upgrade of the envelope, managed to take down the energy use in the building and simultaneously give back net square footage back to the GSA in the same process. I mean, envelope is 50% of the energy consumption of a building. All you got to do is sit at Rockefeller Center, look up and down 6th Avenue, and scratch your head. So, I mean, that is I mean, there's a lot of other strategies out there, but envelope is definitely the one that we would look to first.
And I will completely disagree from someone who works in the real estate industry, because no one who's looking at real estate currently will even suggests that we look at the envelope because of the cost per square foot, right? Not only cost, but also kind of the disruption to tenants. In order to make that choice, you'd make it as a holistic kind of building choice. So we just completed a full renovation and redevelopment at 330 Madison, which is at the corner of 42nd and Madison. So the building got completely new curtain wall, new windows, new everything, new chiller plant, new lobby. You go in, it looks like a completely new building. You wouldn't know it was, you know, an old building that just got redeveloped. So in terms of the day-to-day stuff, what do you do today to make it more efficient tomorrow? You start looking at the insides of a building, because the envelope choice, as a real estate person, you'd never make that choice until you actually got to a point where you said, oh, you know what, we should actually make this building look different and, you know, put a lot of money into the building. So, you know, in terms of the choices that we make, what we find is that all of these buildings, the average age of our building portfolio here is 50 years old. And as I've looked through the portfolio, this next year we have, you know, $2 million allocated just for energy efficiency across 10 buildings. And what we did was we did audits and retro-commissioning. We came up with a list of kind of the most obvious things that you should do, which is go from, you know, constant volume, you know, air handling units to variable volume. You do VFDs, you do new motors, you do the things that, you know, if you had to keep the building exactly the way it was in terms of tenancy, in terms of, you know, not disrupting anything that's happening, you change out the guts. And that's what you do. I mean, you start there, and then you figure out what else to do. And the other thing that we started to do is do the tenant piece. So we built an energy management system for tenants. We've sub-metered everybody. We give them their own data so they can actually look at it and start saving themselves. So that behavior piece is also very important.
I will say, though, that excuse me, some of our development clients across the country are looking at that option quite seriously, and we just completed one in San Francisco 2 years ago. Number one, it's a chance, without the land cost, it's a chance to reposition an asset into a different class, to take it from class B or C up to class A without the normal associated development costs, such as putting up the structure and buying the land and doing all of that. So in this market, especially when commercial development opportunities in the US are harder now, we see among our clients potential there in many locations for that reason. So.
That's great. I think that's all the time we have. So.
Okay, and before everybody runs, I just want to have Vishaan say a couple of closing words, thanking you all for your longevity, if nothing else.
Yes. Thank you all for staying through the afternoon. I really want to thank Kate for putting together a terrific afternoon for us. And I want to thank all of the panelists and participants who were really terrific, and I learned a lot. I hope you did as well. I know there are refreshments waiting outside, so I'm going to be extremely brief. One of the things that I really took away from the afternoon's conversation in terms of looking back 25 years versus looking forward into the next generation, which is really what we're doing here with our students and everything we do in terms of our research and our pedagogy, is just an extraordinary understanding of how much more complex this field has become than it really was. And it was plenty complex to begin with in 1986, right? So, I would echo many of the things that many of the panelists said, except for one thing that Richard said, my good friend Richard, which is I don't believe we're frenemies. I believe we're very firmly rooted in this building for very good reasons. I look at a couple of the people who graduated from last year's class, and there was a preponderance of architects in last year's class who are doing this cross-dressing thing, as their leader has done, from developer to architect and planner. But beyond that, I think of a number of people with pure finance backgrounds who've come through the program and have gained incredible sensitivities to issues of sustainability, to issues of affordability, of even how to read a site plan, Richard. So, there are extraordinary things, I think, that we're doing here. The reason we're trying to build the space over in Amsterdam is to then take that up to a whole other level. So I hope as the years progress, you will continue to come back. It was thrilling to have you all here, and we will hopefully have our next set of events within the next couple of years over in Amsterdam, and it'll be great to see you there. Thanks very much. Enjoyed seeing you all.